I would love to introduce you to Andrea Sielaff, who is the Program Evaluation Manager for the Center for Transforming Engagement at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. She's going to be sharing with us today. Her professional experience includes campus ministry, teaching vocational direction at the Seattle School, leading MDiv apprenticeship groups at Fuller Seminary. Andrea is the co-author of several resources for clergy well-being, including the literature review of clergy resilience and recommendations for future research in the Journal of Psychology and Theology. Also, as a bonus, I get to work with Andrea occasionally and just really enjoy her contributions, her sense of humor, and getting to be with her in this space. So to get things started, I'll say, welcome, Andrea. We're looking forward to your presentation today. So it's all you. Take it from here.
Great. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And now I feel like I have to be funny, Allison. So I'll have to try to live up to that reputation. But thank you for introducing me. And I am delighted to be here with you all today. Presenting, as Allison said, I work for the Center for Transforming Engagement. We provide cohorts, coaching, and consultation to support the well-being of individual Christian leaders as well as congregations. And our host institution, the Seattle School, is a graduate school that trains psychologically informed Christian faith leaders as well as theologically informed counselors. So I'll be presenting today about the findings of a research study that we did about a particular kind of small group supporting clergy well-being. I'm really hoping that this sparks with some great conversations about best practices in small groups for clergy, that you can share your knowledge with each other, as well as connecting to some of the pieces we're bringing today. All right. So let me start by sharing the context of these small groups. In 2017, we designed a year-long program to support clergy well-being called the Resilient Leaders Project. We built this program on two foundational ideas. First, fruitful ministry comes from a healthy relational style. By that, I mean patterns of how we relate to God, self, and others. The second foundational idea was that resilience is not like a quick bounce back when hard things happen. Instead, you can see this U curve here. It is a willingness to descend into tolerable discomfort that leads to increased capacity. We call it building a muscle. There's tolerable discomfort, and then the result is increased capacity. So based on this foundation, we created a three-part model of resilience: people, practice, and purpose. And the program followed along with this module, with a module of learning for each of those three components, along with continuous small groups. The small groups, which use narrative process, and we call them circles, they met for multiple times during each 3-day module, and in between modules for an approximate time of 25 hours together. As we did program evaluation, our surveys really showed that the participants said that circles, more than any other element, was what helped increase their resilience in this program. So given that impact that we were seeing, we were motivated to do this study in hopes of being able to identify and share some best practices with people like you who are on the front lines of promoting clergy well-being and supporting them. So we interviewed 19 alumni from 3 different years of the program, and we looked at 2 main questions. First, what elements of narrative process groups contribute to the improvement of resilience? And second, what elements of resilience are improved by narrative process groups among Christian leaders? A little more background on narrative process groups, which again we call circles. So they use this narrative process, which means that participants share stories and process stories from their past and their present in a safe group setting. Narrative process groups are based on the idea that our identity emerges from our story and how it interacts with the story of God in the world. Narrative process uses stories from individuals' lives to increase their understanding of their relational style, which often is formed based on relationships and experiences that we have in childhood. And it allows participants to see new possibilities for their future. So here's a little bit more about how this kind of group works. Before we gather, each participant is given directions to write a story from a very specific childhood memory that has marked their life uniquely in its pain. And then at the first gathering of the circles, each participant has a turn sharing their story. The stories have been about things, life experiences like a parent's divorce, or betrayal by a close friend, or experiencing a moment of intense shame where you really have that self-consciousness, or even sometimes an experience of abuse. After each participant shares their story, they receive guided feedback from other members of the group. And sharing this original story, along with developing a perspective of life as story, that's really the foundation for the rest of the group's work together. As one of our participants noted, it's almost like doing relationship in reverse. You start with that deep, vulnerable backstory before you look at the present and everyday. So these initial early childhood stories that participants share become a touchstone for those groups as they work through the other content in the program, people, spiritual practices, life purpose, and as they consider what their relationships, both with in their personal life and in their pastoral life, how those are going and how they are showing up there. Before I get into the specific findings of the study, we're going to send you back to small groups to connect around a couple of questions. First, how have you seen unhealthy relationship styles, which is patterns of relating to self, God, or others? How have you seen that impact clergy well-being? And then second, how have you incorporated narrative process, working with stories from clergy's past and present, into your work with clergy or congregations? If you haven't used them, what possibilities do you see in doing so?
All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to dive into part 2 of our presentation, so I'll invite Andrea to take it away.
Thank you. I hope you had productive discussions there, and we'll get to have one more breakout. But let's start here with the findings for our first research question. We were looking for themes in our interviews about what elements of narrative process groups contribute to the improvement of resilience. And we found 5 themes: facilitator leadership or convener facilitation, a being with stance, story-based, commonality and diversity, and structural elements. So let's look first at convener facilitation. Okay, so alumni noted that our distinctive facilitation style was really a key factor in developing group trust and building resilience for them. The facilitators in circles are trained, and we train them to not take the detached stance of a therapist or the expert stance of an educator. Instead, we really want to train them in parallel process, meaning they function similarly to participants in that they're doing the work of their own resilience and processing their growth in that small group alongside participants, while also, and we know this is a tricky balance, but while also holding the boundaries of the group and keeping the group on task. So this facilitation style models for participants both how to engage in vulnerable ways, and perhaps even more importantly, what it can look like to show up authentically as a leader and have true mutuality in a group. As we know, pastors can be really good, clergy can be really good at always at avoiding intimacy or that vulnerability by always being the caregiver or the provider or the expert. So this really challenges that relational style and shows a different way for them to relate and show up authentically as a leader in their context. All these slides with the themes have quotes from individuals in our study. I'm not going to read all of them, but they're there for you if you want to come back and look at those later or read along as we go. So our second theme is being with, and circles start with the premise: no fixing, no saving, no advising. And then we frame those guidelines in the positive. Show up as a whole person, thinking and feeling. Eliminate distractions, like be present, and respect where someone is today. So instead of the fixing each other problem, we encourage participants to really just be with, be attentive to the person who's sharing. After a person shares their story, there's often a time of silence there for the other participants to really just take in what they're hearing, notice what they're feeling and thinking themselves before they respond. Interviewees named both the silence and the kinds of responses that the group offered as important. And very interestingly, I think one of the cohorts that we studied was entirely online due to COVID, and they were using the same language to describe their experience. They felt held, they felt seen, they felt sat with, all these embodied experiences that we don't really associate with online groups. Story-based and from the start. Participants said much of the impact of the narrative process groups was attributable to story work, both what kinds of stories were shared and how those were incorporated throughout the program. So exploring a painful childhood experience with the group helped participants to see patterns in their lives, especially patterns of how they relate in the present day. Here's a quote that I will share from a participant. Oh, I'm sorry, I went a few slides back. Here's a quote that I will share from a participant. What comes to mind as being impactful is all the story stuff, starting with the early childhood story and the experience I had of increasing my understanding. I knew somewhat why I ended up in the helping professions or as a pastor, but I didn't know how deeply broken and wounded I was and how much that influenced why I ended up as a pastor. It was a roller coaster of, holy crap, I am super broken. No wonder I chose to be a pastor. I shouldn't have done that. But then seeing that partial brokenness led you in that direction, and that direction was part of God's plan of redemption for me and my story. So it was about refinding hope. The narrative gave vision for life, not just vocationally, but who am I becoming? So we found that this new awareness of relational style and how it was shaped in the past helped participants to see how they were showing up with people in the present. It helped them develop an imagination and even practice new ways of relating to people going forward. As one interviewee said, most of us without story work would be very reactive leaders instead of responsive leaders. The fourth theme that we found about elements that could suggest best practices is commonality and diversity. So when placing people in groups, we strive to balance those two things. Groups that have shared affinities while also looking to incorporate a variety of perspectives. And how we do that is we have participants submit their stories in advance of the first module, and we place them in groups around commonalities, such as a group that had all experienced having to take on parent-level responsibilities as children, what in the counseling world we call parentified children, or a group that had all experienced abandonment, or a group that all worked in high trauma contexts. While commonality is the primary goal here, the secondary goal was diversity in experience, career stage, ethnicity, cultural identity, and sex. And so in that way, those circles become a practice space for what many of our clergy and Christian leaders have to do today, which is relating across difference. The impacts of this approach that participants noted included a non-competitive environment, feeling less alone, and vicarious learning. The fifth and final element that we found on this first question was structural elements. And I've listed some of them there. I want to highlight time limits. Time limits were for individual sharing. So all of our groups had structured time. Each person gets to share this much time, has response time of this much time, and a timekeeper to hold to that. You know, as someone who works with clergy groups, it's really tricky to deal with that balance of the clergy who likes to talk a lot and the clergy who won't assert themselves because they're self-sacrificing. And this structure really seemed to be appreciated for having that protected time. As a participant said, the structure gave everyone opportunity, space, and time to share. Each person had a dedicated time, which for people who work in ministry, there isn't a lot of time dedicated to you and what you were working through. We're going to head into our third breakout groups, and here are some questions for you to consider together. Which of these small group elements that I just discussed, and you'll get this list, which ones suggest best practices that might work in your context? And how might you adapt one of these elements if you're intrigued by it for use in your context? The results of the second question, what elements of resilience are improved by this kind of small group? And we found 4 themes: self-awareness, self-compassion, leadership skills, and relationships. So I'm just going to look more closely at 2 of those today. We do have a report that has more full detail of all of that that we'll link at the end of the presentation here. So let's look at self-awareness. I'm sure you're familiar, if you know research on clergy resilience, that self-awareness is really important for a variety of reasons. 2 that I would want to highlight because of how this shows up in the news these days. Self-awareness can reduce narcissistic tendencies, and it can also reduce workaholic behaviors that lead to burnout, which we're seeing showing up a lot. So our interviewees noted that their self-awareness was increased as the circle helped them make connections between what had happened to them in the past and how they relate to people in their ministry now. Several of them noted that increased self-awareness led to increased agency as they saw new ways to respond to situations instead of reenacting their past. One participant said, "It's a lot about becoming more aware, better informed about how I show up in interactions with others, whether one-to-one or large group leadership, being more free to respond and less compelled to react in my typical ways." So self-awareness grew through the feedback that the participants received from other group members. And by listening to the kind of curiosity and questions that they received from members of their circle, participants practiced assessing their own motivations and actions, which gives them skills to build more self-awareness in an ongoing manner. Second thing we're going to highlight is self-compassion. If you haven't run into that term before, Kristen Neff defines it as having 3 elements. First, self-kindness, being kind and understanding towards oneself in instances of pain or failure, rather than being highly self-critical. Second element is common humanity, and that's perceiving one's experiences as part of the larger human experience, rather than seeing your own experiences as separating and isolating. And third is mindfulness, holding painful thoughts and feelings in balanced awareness, rather than over-identifying with them. So among Christian leaders, higher levels of self-compassion correlate with increased ministry satisfaction and lower levels of burnout, as well as lower levels of emotional exhaustion. Our interviewees noticed that their circles helped them to see when they weren't treating themselves with kindness. Often this showed up in moments when the leader was able to articulate an expectation that they had for themselves that they wouldn't have for other human beings. Noticing those impossible standards really prompted them to practice greater self-compassion. So as we wrap up, before we get to the Q&A, I have a slide here, and I think you'll have access to these slides later that has a bunch of resources, but here are a few things that I really want to highlight. We want to amplify the importance of providing a format where participants can really deepen their understanding of how and why they might be contributing to their own issues in isolation, while also growing in self-compassion and experiencing the compassion of others. So this exploration of a leader's personal story, both past and present, is key to refining relational style and to helping leaders choose more healthy practices. All right, Allison, back to you for the Q&A intro. Oh, actually, I do have one more thing before we enter Q&A. I have a colleague here, Rose Madrid Sweatman, and Dr. Sweatman is the Associate Director of the Center for Transforming Engagement. I've invited her to jump in and address questions as well if they fall more into her area of expertise or she has expanding comments.
Yeah. Real quick, welcome Rose and Andrea. Are you able to share the slide that you mentioned that has the resources on it? And just for a kind of a starter question, what is some of the work that you do when you're determining the commonality, Karen asks, of a circle's participants? Could you expand on what the participants share with a facilitator before the groups are formed? So any pre-work that you're doing to help those groups form.
Yeah. So several times that was my task. And honestly, I make a spreadsheet and I list on there their stage of life, their age, their story themes. So looking for commonalities there. And I'm also really careful to list their work context or denomination, because we try not to put people from the same denomination or work context together. We find that that creates a more competitive environment. If you're in a group where someone might eventually be your boss, or you might be competing for a job someday. So that is part of, that's part of what we do when we look at that. It's the spreadsheet and then pulling people into different groups, seeing how they look and rearranging as needed.
Is there anything that you've kind of learned, like, this doesn't work well together?
Yeah, well, okay. Another rule that I didn't have time to go into is we do try to do no solos, and that's particularly we found important around sex and ethnicity or culture. So putting someone in a group where they're the only man or the only woman, that hasn't worked well. We have, I mean, this was a risk that I took in putting people together. We had someone from a very conservative university who was a chaplain for a branch in the military, and someone who was a Unitarian, United Church of Christ, very far on the other spectrum of theological progressiveness. And we put them in a group together because they were both working in really high trauma contexts. And I think I have a quote on one of the slides where the female pastor said, "I thought I was going to hate this guy, but we bonded so quickly." And by the end, we laughed about that we had like stalked each other on Facebook and been like, what the heck? And then that human connection, which with all that's happening in our world today, we need those variety of perspectives. But yeah, I would say no solos is our other rule.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So as you talked about your value of no fixing, no advising, no all of that, it seems like there's some kind of training and preparation of the facilitators and conveners. So Tamos is asking, how long is that training process for them? Do you assume prior experience in small group work? Like, how do you actually get those facilitators to do what you're asking them to do if it's not their typical MO?
Yeah. And I might ask Rose to chime in on this a little bit, but we have done several things. So we have hired a lot of our own graduates. Our theological graduates at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology have also done these formative group experiences and are familiar with story work, as well as counseling students who have graduated, because we know they have that narrative process background and some of that self-awareness. We have also hired graduates from our program. So once they go through the curriculum, they have a good understanding of how that process works. And then we do some additional training with them. I think another important piece is that we always do debrief preparation and debrief with our facilitators so that they have a safe space where they can continually be learners too, which is what we want for them. Rose, do you have anything you would want to add to that?
No, I think you kind of covered it. Like, I'm doing a circle group right now that just started, and I have a co-convener who's going to start another group, but he's working with me, like shadowing me. He's participating a little in the group, but again, same. We train them in real time, and I won't repeat what you've said. Most of them have an alum of one of our groups or the school.
Yeah. I think there's kind of two questions that are on a similar vein of both. How do you prepare a group to be so vulnerable with one another? And then also in the midst of hearing and experiencing those stories that we're assuming are vulnerable, how are you giving guidelines for listening and responding to what's shared? So could you speak to both the preparation for sharing vulnerably and then how we're training to respond in the moment when we're hearing those stories shared?
Yeah. So another part of the entry process or the on-ramp, they had, we're not doing this anymore, but the people in this study, they had interviews with an admission officer, just a brief interview, and received recommendations to participate as well. And we had some pre-work that we had them do. So both in addition to writing this story and myself as person who placed people into groups, we would let them know if the story was out of bounds, like, this is too much. we have like, we call the trauma scale, like this is like a 10 on the trauma scale, and we're looking more for like a 4 to 6, or like there's not a lot here to work with. Can you dive deeper into this? And then another piece, we created a video, I'll let Rose say a little bit about this, that talks about difference, theological difference. And then also, I think maybe it was you or Maddie and Forrest modeling. Do you remember this video?
Mm-hmm.
Modeling how that could go.
Yeah, right now, as you enter a circle, what we do is like the very first thing out of introductions and getting to know each other is we have a little content on how we listen, deep listening skills, how we respond, and also how we hold theological, political, and cultural and other difference. So we actually do the training in the circle of how, as part of the guidelines.
Yeah.
Do you have, some are curious to have a copy of the research study, and as I'm hearing you share like these videos and stuff, what of what you just said is also available for folks that are like, I want to see that, I want to check out that video, I want to do the research study?
Yeah, the research study, and we have other downloadable reports and some resources, like one that's really been valued is a self-care menu. Those are available on our website, Center for Transforming Engagement, under resources. Offerings tells you some ways to connect with us and the current circle offerings that we're doing. We're developing, we've developed a shorter, more condensed program format, and we're rolling one out for leaders that will do even more with that story work. So those are available there. We don't have like a train the trainer yet, but if you are interested in receiving that kind of training, for sure, reach out, email us at Transforming Engagement, and we will connect with you. We love partnerships.
Did you discover in your research, like this is a good size of group? I heard you saying no solos, you know, some other things. Like what about group size? I hear you talking about Zoom and in person, like any other kind of parameters you'd add to it?
Group size. So our goal was 6 participants with 1 facilitator. With the time allotments that we had, 4 was a little too small, and anything more than 6 was not enough time. So I would say 4 to 6 is ideal. And we did find that the groups worked online and they worked in person. I don't know that we did a particular lot different. Yeah, Rose, go ahead.
Right now, the resilient circles we're doing. So just to clarify, right now we're hosting resilient circles that do not include story work. It is an introduction to all the resilient work, and it's 8 months, 2 hours online each month with content assignment. Resilient Leader will be launching probably right after the first of the year. That will include story work. And we asked, like, the Resilient Circle is a prerequisite, not necessary, but we recommend it to then come into the Leaders Circle. And for the circles we are now doing, we're doing 5 to 8. So smallest is 5, largest is 8.
And is everybody having equal time to share in those? So every time you show up, you're getting your allotted time, is what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. What I know that within this group, and I'm hoping if there's more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Thank you for everybody. I know that in this group we have denominational leaders and, you know, lead pastors, and it can be intriguing. Oh, let me use this on my team. And yet that also creates a power dynamic, or if you're authority over somebody. So how do you handle if people are here hearing this and going, I want to implement this with my own team or my own staff or my own group? Any advice or thoughts about that?
I would say research has shown that interdenominational groups work better for this kind of thing. So I would be very cautious as a denominational leader, pushing this, rolling this out, unless you have a trainer that is separate from the power structure. I also wouldn't recommend doing this just with a staff team. Yeah, what would you say, Rose?
Well, I would agree, because the vulnerability in the group happens quickly because we create a safe enough environment, and they're not usually in dual relationships with people. So that makes people way more vulnerable to be honest with what's really going on, because they're not there with a staff person that is going to go, oh man, like it just creates way more safety and way more vulnerability.
Yeah, but we found that leaders then in these interviews even talked about how they take that back to their context, both in how they show up and then being able to use some of the language in how they influence their elder boards or what other boards that help create expectations for them and the way they relate to people. Yeah. Rose, did you have?
Well, I'll just say our theory of change at the school is it starts with the leader. So the leader goes through a circle, and as Andrea is saying, they can bring back some of those tools like, oh, I maybe not teach all that we've done, but they are different and they're able to be different. And then their team, they start sending team members through, then that will eventually, I'm always going to say bleed out, but that is not the right phrase. We'll get out to the congregation, like the leader, the team, the org is how we view our theory of change.